Great. Well, hi everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks all very much for coming. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. I see a few people are still coming in. My name is Mike Carlish. I'm a lecturer here in the English faculty at Oxford, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of Tessa Roynon's new book, The Classical Tradition in Modern American Fiction, published by Edinburgh University Press. As many of you will know, Tessa is a Senior Research Fellow at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford. And so we're very grateful to the RAI for hosting this event. And I'd especially like to thank Alice and Mitch for all their help in organising this evening. They've both been really fantastic. And as I hope will become clearer over the course of the next hour or so as we discuss it, The Classical Tradition in Modern American Fiction is a really brilliant book. It's a book that offers us a series of rich and inventive readings tracing allusions to and the legacies of classical literature and culture in the work of a whole host of 20th and 21st century American novelists. And in this sense, it builds upon some of the insights of Tessa's earlier work, including most notably her award-winning monograph, Toni Morrison and the Classical Tradition, published by OUP in 2013. But it's not only a brilliant book, it's also that rarer thing, a welcoming book, because it's a book addressed not just to other scholars in the field, but also to undergraduate and postgraduate students, and not just to readers with a working knowledge of the classics, but also to those for whom much of that material might be new and indeed intimidating. And I think something of that breadth of potential readership is reflected in our panel of speakers this evening. So you'll be hearing from a literary critic, a classicist, and one of Tessa's former students. Our first speaker will be Kasha. Kasha is reader in American literature at the University of Cambridge and works primarily on modern American literary and cultural history. Though speaking as one of her former PhD students, I think I can say safely that her work often tends to move into other periods and fields and pursue a more eclectic range of interests, whether in her cultural history of boxing, published in 2008, or more recently in Blooming Flowers, a seasonal history of plants and people, which came out last year with Yale. In 2010, Kasha published a study of the American short story since 1950, and is now working on a book about the history of the great American novel and its relation to the census. And I should say that just due to a last minute unfortunate diary clash, Kasha will be joining us in about hopefully half an hour or so, although she has kindly pre-recorded her talk. So after Kasha's video address, we'll be hearing live and exclusive from Professor Stephen Harrison. Professor Harrison has been a fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and a tutor in Latin there since 1987, and is now a senior research fellow at Corpus and an honorary professor of Latin literature in the classics faculty. His main research interests are in Latin literature and its reception, particularly Augustan poetry, the Roman novel, and Neo-Latin. And his recent work includes edited volumes on Roman receptions of Sappho and on Seamus Heaney and the classics, both published by OUP. Then finally, we'll hear from Julia Adamo. Julia graduated from Kenyon College in May last year with a BA in English after completing her honours thesis, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Woman, Coming of Age Narratives of Women Artists in Contemporary American Literature. She spent her junior year at Oxford, during which she took tutorials with Tessa on classical reception in the modern American novel. And in the process, she read and commented on the manuscript of Tessa's new book. So Julia has a unique perspective to offer. And then after we've heard from our three speakers, we'll open up the floor to questions from everyone in the audience. So to put forward a question, please can I ask that you use the Q&A function, which should just be at the bottom of your screen. So just click on Q&A, type in your question, post it, and then I will read it out. And finally, can I ask also just that your questions be addressed to one of our three speakers rather than to Tessa, because as some of you will know, she's still recovering from an illness in January. So rather than add to her fatigue. Our speakers can do most of the talking for her. So before all of that, Tessa will give us a brief overview and introduction to the book. So thanks very much, everybody, and over to you, Tessa.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that really wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody listening or watching, because I know that attending a Zoom event after a day's work online is a really tall order. So I'm really grateful to you for showing up as well. So I'm planning to do 3 things today. First of all, just give a very brief overview of kind of the structure of the book and how it works. Secondly, read a very brief sort of reflection on the book and what I was trying to do in writing it. And then thirdly, say a few sort of more personal thank yous very briefly, which are also important to me to do on this occasion. So Mitch, if we could have the first slide, please. So what Mitch is going to show, that's the front cover, which I think will get discussed a little bit. That's a photograph I took myself from the African American Museum in Washington, DC. And I'm really pleased with that photograph because it's a kind of different perspective on the kind of iconic classic architecture of Washington, DC. That's a West African influence kind of fretted corona. That's very important to the architecture of the African American Museum, excuse me. And secondly, don't worry, I'm not going to read you through all those slightly fuzzy bullet points on the right. But the most important thing, obviously, about having written this book is trying to sell it and getting you to part with your money. So the good news is at the bottom, you can save 30% with this code, which is new30. And that means you can actually buy this book for about £18. And as I think my last book was a mere £80, I think that's quite a bargain. So obviously don't hold back rushing to the EUP website and buying the book. Great, got the money out of the way. So if we could move on to the second slide, please, Mitch. So if you can read that, I think you just about can. The table of contents, I think, is really useful for kind of getting an overview of how the book works, because obviously in our old world, we would all be piling into the REI and picking up the book and flicking through it. So there are 7 chapters, and I won't list all the novelists now because I'll be doing that in a minute. But you can see what I tried to do is to make the book as user-friendly as possible. So it really does follow a really strict formula. And I did that quite deliberately because although there is lots of new scholarship in the book, so in each of the first section of the chapters, Cather and the classics, Fitzgerald and the classics, Faulkner and the classics, that's a sort of pretty new synthesis of each of these authors' intellectual formation and how they encountered the classical traditions themselves, where they went to college, what kind of reading they did. And then the second part kind of synthesizes existing scholarship, as its title would suggest. And then there are 3 readings, so 3 novels each by each author. And those readings are new, like, of course, they build on prior readings and scholarship, but they are new readings. So there is sort of lots and lots of scholarship in the book. But what I also try to do is bear students and kind of early researchers in mind as much as possible, because I'm really aware in my own experience that when we pick up a monograph, quite often the author is operating at that point at such a sophisticated level that actually sometimes even looking at the chapter headings, it's a bit hard to figure out kind of what's going on or where to home in if you want a particular focus or bit of information. So I've obviously gone to the other extreme here with this very user-friendly formulaic structure. But my hope is in teaching or in studying, you know, say you only wanted to know about the classical tradition in 10 Rivers a Night, you just have to go to that page. And that's all you have to do. You're very welcome, of course, to read the whole book. Highly recommend it. But it's a book sort of with the structure with students very much in mind. And if we go to the final slide, please. So carries on in the same vein, 3 more novelists. And then the last things I wanted to draw your attention to were the conclusion, where I talk about lots of other novelists. So I focused on 7 very canonical, well-known authors. And my reason for doing that was because they might be the most taught and the most popular and the most obvious. But in the conclusion, I sort of try and give a sense of quite how many authors modern American novelists are alluding to the classical tradition, right, left, and centre, kind of all the time. So there's so much more work to be done in this field, and I don't think I'm going to be the one doing it. But I would really encourage you to think about those other authors like Paul Beatty or Fran Ross or Ishmael Reed or Marcia Southgate, who I mentioned there. That would make me really happy if people sort of pick up where I left off. And last but not least, in my appendices, as I'll say a bit more about, I'm very keen that the classical tradition sort of be accessible to people who haven't had a grounding in it. So I've included a glossary of classical terms of every kind of name and every place and every Greek or Latin word that I use. And I'm not a classicist at all. So I compiled this glossary. Stephen helped me quite a lot. He will be the first to admit. So that you don't actually have to look up things elsewhere unless you want to. You can look them up within the book. And then I recommended other resources as well at the end. So that's the end of my PowerPoint. I'm just going to read a kind of brief reflection on why I wrote the book and what I was trying to do. The US Capitol in Washington, D.C. has been much in the public eye in recent weeks, whether stormed by President Trump's supporters on the 6th of January, or as the hallowed ground that formed the backdrop to President Biden's inauguration 2 weeks later. The gleaming perfection of its neoclassical architecture is an unquestioned part of its iconic status. Sorry, I knew that was going to happen. By contrast, in the classical tradition in modern American fiction, I take a more quizzical and at times skeptical approach to the American love affair with ancient Greece and Rome. I take a long, hard look at American novelists' predilection for classical allusions. This book asks what is at stake when 7 key fiction writers of the 20th and 21st centuries, Willa Cather, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, and Marilynne Robinson, refer to the work of Aeschylus or Homer or Virgil or Ovid in their explorations of modern identity and experience. The project grew out of my perception as a reader and a teacher that we tend to be far too reverential when faced with allusions to Greek and Roman literature, myth, history, or visual art. We tend to assume that such references bestow an immediate and universal authority on a text we're unthinkingly impressed. My own conviction is that we need to pay close attention when modern writers invoke the ancient past, because they often reach for distant heroes and stories in order to discuss some of the most pressing ideological issues of their and our times. F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, is obsessed in his fiction with the decadent and ultimately fallen ancient Rome, and he uses this motif to bolster a nativist and anti-immigrant conception of Americanness. Willa Cather, in Sapphira and the Slave Girl, added many of her classical allusions and framing devices in a very late redrafting stage, almost as an afterthought. She distorts the realities of slavery and racial injustice through deploying old Southern nostalgic and heroic tradition. And Philip Roth disguises a visceral misogyny as masculinity in his much feted novel, The Human Stain, through the repeated association between his protagonist, Coleman Silk, and Zeus. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, which Roth frequently invokes, Zeus is a voracious rapist, but Roth attempts to use him to shore up the sense of Coleman as a virile hero. Why do we tend to be such unalert or acquiescent readers when it comes to antiquity? One reason is that nearly all of us are hazy on the details because we do not study Latin, Greek, or classical civilization at school. A working knowledge of the classical tradition is now, for the most part, the preserve of an elite minority. If we're not exactly sure who Trimalchio, Hector, or Leda is, when these canonical American writers call them up, we're most likely to nod our heads nervously and move quickly on. The classical tradition in modern American fiction sets out to counter this process by insisting that the classical past is accessible to all. Complete with its own glossary of every classical name and concept, as well as a guide to the best among the numerous online resources, the book's underpinned by my sincere conviction that all we need to do when faced with an unfamiliar Greek or Roman term is the blindingly obvious. Look it up. My convictions deeply held for two reasons. First, in teaching these authors to my students over the years, I realized that nearly all of them felt excluded from the entirety of classical culture. They needed encouragement to look things up, but their confidence really grew when they did. Second, I was inspired by my own research into each of these writers' intellectual formation. In order to understand how they encountered the ancient world, I consulted archives and prior scholarship to understand how and where each studied, how they accessed the classical tradition, what they had read, and what they thought about the reading they had done. These writers' contrasting backgrounds and experiences are striking. In the 1890s, Willa Cather studied Latin and Greek to a high level at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Philip Roth was highly educated, including undertaking graduate studies at Chicago, but he never studied the classical languages. Marilynne Robinson has a PhD in English, but studied Latin at high school. Toni Morrison was a classics minor at Howard. Meanwhile, neither Fitzgerald, Faulkner, nor Ellison even completed their undergraduate degrees. The time period which my chosen authors span, so Cather was born in 1873, and Robinson, the only one still living, was born in 1943, encompasses a series of different eras in which classical traditions were variously significant. Fin de siècle decadence, modernism, liberal humanism, the great books tradition, and the culture wars of the 1980s. Yet despite these novelists' widely diverging contexts and their widely diverging levels of formal education, they have in common an unqualified passion for reading and a voracious autodidacticism. For me, encountering firsthand the annotations that Ralph Ellison made, very often about African American life, in the margins of his translations of Aeschylus, for example. All his personal books are in the Library of Congress, and you can go there and kind of read his books and his annotations. This was an unforgettable thrill. Ellison, born in 1913 in Oklahoma City, was so impoverished when he began his undergraduate degree at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama that he rode hobo on trains through the 1930s Deep South to get there. His commitment to his own education, the extraordinary number of books he read in numerous fields, and his stalwart belief in the significance of the classical tradition to his own and to Black American life is a humbling and inspiring example I shall never forget. So that's the end of my reflection. The more personal things I wanted to say lead on from that. First of all, in this new phase of my career that I've just embarked on as a librarian at a wonderful local school, the Swan School, part of my sanctification to doing that was really through encountering how these brilliant writers were so influenced by what they read and the lengths they had to go to get hold of books. So whether it was befriending an adult in their local town who had a vast collection of books because they themselves didn't have the money to buy their own books, or working in the local library like Toni Morrison did, or having a very close friend who had all these books like William Faulkner did, or as Ralph Ellison had to do, work in the blacks only section of the libraries in places where he lived. It was incredibly inspiring to me to see the power that all this reading had. And it struck me the wonderful thing sort of to be able to get books out to people, and hence my new job as librarian in a school. The second thing I wanted to say about the book is that if and when you get hold of your copy, you'll see it's dedicated to the memory of my father, Gavin Roynon, who sadly died 3 years ago when I'd written just 2 chapters. And my father was a teacher who really loved his work, and he was always really supportive of mine. And thirdly, I just want to finish up by thanking everybody who's been involved with this event in particular. There are many, many thank yous in the acknowledgements. So if your name, second time, excellent. If your name is in the acknowledgements, thank you very much again. But focusing on today's event, I wanted to thank Lloyd and Nick, who run the illustrious American Literature Research Seminar, for having me as part of their series. That's a real honor. I wanted to thank everyone at the RAI and Mitch and Alice for this incredibly complicated tech situation that goes on behind the scenes. I had no idea. It's all terrifying to me, but they're amazing, and it's so much work. I'm so grateful. To Michael for the wonderful introduction, and also for his work on Philip Roth, which is why I asked him to be the chair. His own book on male friendship in American fiction is coming out soon. And last but not at all least, to my three speakers. So Kasha, who's a brilliant professor in American literature at Cambridge, has always been interested in my work and supportive. So that means a lot to me. My path through academia has been unconventional in some ways, and when I encounter the people who have always believed in my books, that means a huge amount. I'm really grateful to Kasha, but I'm also, this book very much builds on her work. A brilliant essay she wrote about Philip Roth and the great books tradition really gave me a way to understand all of these novelists, how their books work in relation to the cultures that they were working within. So huge thanks to her. I also know she's unbelievably busy this term, so I'm really grateful that she's been able to send a video today. And next, my colleague at Oxford, Stephen Harrison, has always been a huge supporter of mine. I don't really know why, but I think he was the first person who ever mentioned to me that he'd read the Toni Morrison book without my having forced it upon him. So that's something I'll not forget. He was very supportive when I did a big project on Ovid and ran a conference and then an edited journal afterwards. He's obviously, as I said in the acknowledgements for my book, well, you probably don't know, he's a glutton for punishment, because when I'd finished this book, he read the whole thing, picking up the many, many errors that I'd made about the classical tradition, which is really basic primary school level for him, and correcting all my mistakes with huge tact and patience. And that was absolutely invaluable. And now here he is speaking at my launch, and he's also been a very generous supporter of the library where I now work. So thank you so much, Stephen. And very last, but absolutely not very least, the wonderful Julia Adamo, who is one of the most rewarding students I've worked with. She had the awful experience of reading my chapters in a really rough form and having to make polite comments to her tutor about them. She did that with such goodwill and enthusiasm. It was wonderful. And she's stayed in touch and been really enthusiastic about the book ever since. And just to give you a flavour of her personality, and when I was on Well in January, I wanted to write the piece that I've just read out as a blog piece, but I wasn't well enough to look at the screen yet, although I could write by pen and paper. And I mentioned this to her, and she said if she sent me photos of the handwriting, she would type it up for me so it could then be a blog piece. And sure enough, that's what she did. So thanks so much, Julia. And so without further ado, that's all from me. And I think it's time for Kasha's video, so I've got to figure out how to get rid of myself. So thank you very much, everyone.
Hi. If you're watching this video, it means, well, it just means I've been unavoidably detained. And I hope to be able to join the party before it's all over. So I really want to be able to raise a glass to Tessa and congratulate her on yet another work of essential reading. A book that's not just interesting or provocative, but that offers a grounding for our understanding of modern American fiction. A book that will last and last. The classical tradition, I can't speak, the classical tradition in modern American fiction is already on several reading lists of mine, and there I expect it will stay. In many ways, I think the classical tradition works as a companion volume to Mark McGurl's 2008 study, The Program Era. McGurl makes an extremely convincing case for the rise of creative writing, as he says, the most important event in post-war American literary history. But not every writer did an MFA or only did an MFA. Tessa's work draws attention to the other, more traditional, we could say, kinds of education that so many post as well as pre-war novelists had. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Willa Cather, William Faulkner. Sure, we kind of accept that they're going to be here. Well, Ellison a little bit later, but yes, absolutely. But in the classical tradition and in her other books and essays, Tessa reminds her how important Greek and Roman texts were to Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, Marilynne Robinson. These are her core authors, but she also touches on Fran Ross, Percival Everett, Paul Beattie, Jesmyn Ward. So I can feel a second volume coming on. Noting that 21st century readers can sometimes approach classical allusions with fear and undue deference, Tessa is far from being an elegist for the world of great books. This is no Alan Bloom kind of affair. Classical tradition is a slyly political study, reminding us at every turn that classicism is never neutral and that intertextuality should be approached with, as she puts it, skeptical scrutiny. Tessa begins unexpectedly and brilliantly with Beattie's The Sellout, set in Washington, D.C. that is, quote, supposed to feel like ancient Rome, that is, if the streets of ancient Rome were lined with homeless Black people, bomb-sniffing dogs, tour buses, and cherry blossoms. And she ends brilliantly and unexpectedly with the view of neoclassical DC from the Museum of African American History and Culture, an image that's on the cover of the book. Hold on. As well, I'm sure you've all got it there. And that encapsulates, an image that encapsulates the book's witty, elegant, and open-minded approach. Thanks, Tessa, and hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you, Kasha, for that wonderful introduction on the book. So I'm the classicist in this arrangement, and I want to say, first of all, how useful this book will be for classicists studying classical reception. I've learned a lot from it myself, reading through the manuscript, and I think it is, as Kasha said, and as Tessa herself has implied, it's so wonderfully user-friendly, as well as having fantastically rich readings of some really important writers. But I want to think about what I often term the $64,000 question about classical reception, which is, why do certain authors use certain classical texts in this way? Why do they choose certain horses for certain courses? Now, Tessa gives us some very good answers here, I think, and I really particularly like the way in which she sketches out the educational experience of all her authors. I think that's incredibly important because it can be very diverse. I suppose many of them share the great books background in American universities, which is still there in some institutions. And it's interesting that the two kinds of writing that get most cited in Tessa's book from the classical world are epic, especially Homer, and tragedy. Both of them have more than 50 references in the index. I checked it. And these are, of course, central and canonical genres that will get on to get great books programs, which always have Homer and Virgil and Aeschylus and so on. But I think they're also thematically relevant to American culture. And I think this is one of the great strengths of the book, that it shows why certain things are picked. So take, for example, Homer. Now, the Iliad has quite often been compared to the American Civil War, an interesting comparison where you have a long war, which has a lot of stalemate, as the Iliad does, and a war in which the losers in the narrative get a fairly sympathetic treatment. And Tessa mentioned Willa Cather's account of the Civil War dead in Sapphira and the Slave Girl, in which I think, of course, Cather belongs to the plains in Nebraska in American literary history, but our roots are in Virginia, and here she is following the Southern approach. One surprising thing, perhaps, is there hasn't been a kind of Iliadic novel on Vietnam, which in some ways is an equally pointless war, lots of similarities. So major military power goes to another place, trashes it, and then leaves. There have been some interesting representations of Vietnam in American poetry. I think of Doug Anderson's The Moon Reflected Fire. But I think where Tessa really scores on the epic side is her pinpointing of the Odyssey, the journey poem of Odysseus returning home. And I think some of the really most exciting and moving parts of this book are the parts in which the Odyssey becomes the narrative of the Black journey to freedom from the south to the north. I think especially of Ralph Ellison and The Invisible Man, that really amazing book. I think the journey from the south to New York, adventures in disguise, just like Odysseus, and even a kind of climactic battle. And of course, Toni Morrison in jazz, again, that movement from the south to the north, that Odyssean journey. And here, of course, she's building on her wonderful work on Toni Morrison, in her book on Toni Morrison and the classics, and her more recent book on Ralph Ellison, two amazing writers, I think, who have really taken the Odyssean theme and run with it. So that's epic. What about tragedy? Well, tragedy, I think, is, again, she has rightly zoomed in on, because it really does, Greek tragedy really links very well with some of the great American novelists. I think particularly of William Faulkner and his narratives of doomed Southern families, especially the Sutpens in Absalom, where of course we have a Civil War setting. And interesting to reflect that this doesn't just happen in American fiction. I think of Faulkner's contemporary Eugene O'Neill and the fantastic play Long Day's Journey into Night, where we have the fall of a Connecticut family, because for me, the principal subject of Greek tragedy is the fall of a great family. And that's exactly, as Tessa shows, what Faulkner is doing in Absalom. Of course, another aspect of tragedy is Greek tragedy is its depiction of strong, suffering women who are forced by men to sacrifice personal happiness and family life. And here, as Kasha says, we see the moral force of classical reception as Tessa presents it, which I think is incredibly important. Toni Morrison and Beloved, one of the great novels of the 20th century, I think, an extraordinary book. And of course, this is the presentation in modern terms of the story of Medea, the strong woman who is forced by terrible circumstances and by men in particular to sacrifice her own children. But as Tessa points out, Beloved also is a version of the story of Oedipus, where you get the person who has done the terrible thing, who then comes to terms somehow with what he or she has done. And I can only recommend to go and read Tessa's book on Toni Morrison and the classics. Now, one of the things I've worked on as a classicist is the ancient novel, as Michael said in his nice introduction, and it's a surprise to many people that novels actually exist in the classical world. It was a surprise to some classicists in the 20th century, but they do exist, and one of the virtues of Tessa's book is she's very aware of that. They're often treated, I think, as authentication for the novel form. So it's got to be okay because it's back there in the classical period. And really, the thing that most classicists know about classical reception in American literature is that the great American novel, Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, was originally called Trimalchio, or Trimalchio at West Egg. And Trimalchio is one of the anti-heroes of the great novel by Petronius called the Satirica. And Gatsby recalls Trimalchio famously as a great party giver, as someone who's kind of luxurious and rich, but who's also rather mysterious and a bit of a parvenu. We don't know where he has come from. And if there is going to be a second volume of Tessa's work, which I hope there will, it's interesting to reflect on how Petronius has had quite a run in 20th century US novels, partly because he's very satirical, and he's particularly satirical about materialism and mindless materialism, cultural ignorance juxtaposed with riches. And I suppose the book I think of in particular is Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanities. Now, you'll remember that along with Oliver Stone's film Wall Street of the same year, 1987, this is the classic satire on 1980s Wall Street, greed and materialism, telephone number salaries, etc. And it tells the story of Sherman McCoy, who is a millionaire Wall Street trader. And in a central chapter of the book, Sherman and his wife, Judy, go at very great expense in a hired car 7 blocks around the corner to a pretentious dinner party given by a couple called the Bavardages. And this is a reworking of a very famous scene in Petronius's novel where Trimalchio gives this very luxurious dinner. So it's inheriting not just the classical tradition, but also the tradition of the Great Gatsby. And just to finish, the other great ancient novel, in Latin at least, is Apuleius's Golden Ass or Metamorphoses. And here, an interesting figure is Eudora Welty. Now, Tessa says that Eudora would have had a chapter in her book if there had been room. And I think that's absolutely right, because one of late Welty works, early work, the Robber Bridegroom, a novella, is a story which is quite plainly based on aspects of Apuleius's novel. And this is another local story. It's set in the Mississippi in the Natchez Trail. And I won't go into the details here. But also William Faulkner, who's already been mentioned, in The Reivers, his last novel, 1962, it has its protagonist, Lucius Priest, has the same name as the protagonist of Apuleius's Metamorphoses, who actually ends up as a priest in Apuleius's novel. So Lucius Priest is quite clearly an allusion, and there are other ways in which the novel plays with Apuleius. So it's really great to see this book. It will be fantastically useful for classicists studying classical reception, not least in US universities, where I don't think there really is anything of this kind available, as there's lots available for classical films, but for classicizing novels, this is a real pioneer work, and I think it will do extremely well, both in the UK and in the US. So what does this book do? Well, it shows that the classical tradition is a central element of both plot and characterization in modern American fiction, and that it remains so in current work. It's not stopping, as her conclusion makes clear. It's wonderfully presented, greatly helpful for the reader, very clear, and it's presented with political passion because, as has already been said a couple of times, what's important is not just the classical tradition, but how it's used in the cause of humanity and justice. And I think that comes out very well from Tessa's book. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Adamo, and I graduated from Kenyon College in 2020. I had the pleasure of studying with Tessa while I was at Oxford from 2018 to 2019, and taking a class in literature, 1910 to present, as well as the classical reception and the modern American novel. It was really exciting getting to read her manuscript and see it all come together and read each of these individual chapters on these different writers as I was studying them. It was a really amazing resource. I'd only read about half of these authors coming into the course, and so it was exciting to both approach works that I did know, such as The Great Gatsby or Toni Morrison's Jazz, from this new perspective. And even more exciting was diving into works that I hadn't yet read, using the classics as a guiding place. So thank you so much, Tessa, for everything you've taught me, and also for having me as part of this event. I've never taken a classics course or studied Latin or Greek. I learned the Greek alphabet when I was younger because I had an interest in Greek mythology, but I've never studied the classics officially. So it was really exciting coming to this new subject from an American literature background. I really loved Tessa's chapter on Faulkner because she points to the value of looking at the way he's using complicated allusions rather than archetypes for the different characters. I have a real interest in modernism, and I've always found Faulkner's works really challenging, but also really rewarding. And so I think that her chapter does a really great job pointing us towards certain allusions to look for, but also teaching readers how to look for new allusions and interpret them in the context of the work as a whole. Tessa writes about how it's dangerous to read Faulkner's engagement with antiquity exclusively in terms of a, quote, mythical and archetypal preoccupation, because doing so, quote, reduces the complexity and conceals the instability of Faulkner's work. I think there's a lot of instability to be exploring in his works. And so when it came time to write on Faulkner, I ended up focusing on Lena Grove from Light in August, who is an impoverished young woman who is pregnant. And I looked at the different allusions that he has, you know, to characterize her as a mother. Not only is he drawing on classical figures, but he also is drawing on the Christian figure of Mary. And so there's a lot of complications there. You know, he draws on the goddess Eos, who's the goddess of dawn, but he also talks about, you know, Diana, who's an original goddess. And so it's really interesting to see how they all emphasize her complexity and, you know, then support Tessa's theory that, or not theory, but her conviction that these allusions are complicated and there's a lot of value in looking at the different layers. I also really like Tessa writes, one of the most striking aspects of Faulkner's classicism is not his depiction of white traditionalists, such as the Latin literature-loving Mr. Compson or myth-obsessed Reverend Hightower, but rather the way he deploys classical tradition to explore the experiences of Black or mixed race characters. In such moments, it is arguable that he writes very much against the dominant local grain. And it's really interesting to me to see how the different writers that Tessa is discussing are drawing on the classical tradition in different ways with different sorts of characters. I was really interested in Tessa's critique of Philip Roth using the classical reception lens because she touches on some of the issues that I've had with his writing. I think that Philip Roth is an excellent prose writer, but I've always had some issues with the way that he depicts women. I think that there's, you know, undercurrents of misogyny, and I've actually had lots of arguments with friends from college about whether or not we can call his writing sexist based on his portrayal of women and men talking about women. And so Tessa talks a lot about how classicism is key to the eradication of female credibility and power in Roth's novels. She writes, the author portrays women with great certainty and singularity. Through multiple layers of narrative framing, they are consistently subordinated to roles as enablers of male ascendancy, as laughable would-be destroyers, or as fulfillers of male sexual desire. And as she mentioned in her introduction, it's particularly interesting the way that Zeus is evoked in Human Stain, because it validates this masculinity that's often violent or predatory. She also writes of American Pastoral that all of the women characters have an element of the mythological or allegorical about them. They are, for the most part, less real and less psychologically realized than the men. So I think that being able to use the classical allusions that we see in his novels to understand why we might have this feeling that there are different ways that he's treating the men and women, we can see that in the allusions that he's drawing on there. I really enjoyed diving into classical reception studies while studying American literature with Tessa. I had been familiar, like I said, with only about half of the authors coming into this. And so it was really exciting using this lens to, you know, have something to grasp onto while studying Faulkner, or, you know, having these things to look for while reading Marilynne Robinson, who's become one of my favorite writers since taking this course. I think that Tessa's research does a really great job of pointing us towards certain allusions while also teaching us how to look for and interpret different allusions on our own. So while studying Cather, I ended up developing an interest in her work, and the Song of the Lark was a central part of my thesis that I did at Kenyon about coming of age narratives. And so working with Tessa and learning how to, you know, look at the ways that these authors are drawing on the classical tradition gave me, you know, a new aspect to bring to that project that I was doing. And the research that she did on Cather really helped me do my own research there. I think that the structure of the book, as everyone else has mentioned, is really brilliant because it's very user-friendly and allows you to find exactly what you're looking for, but as a whole, it's also really cohesive. And she references different authors in the different chapters. So it is this really great full picture, but it's also very easy to find the specific information that you want. And I appreciate the attention that she put into making such a comprehensive glossary. I know this has been an invaluable resource to other students approaching these texts from a literature background rather than a classics background, because there were lots of figures that I didn't know coming into this, but this is just such a fantastic resource. In her conclusion, Tessa writes, that her discussions are, quote, a starting point only. They're an invitation to future scholars and students, not only to continue the analysis of these palimpsetic texts and authors, but also to develop critical discussion on numerous other classically elusive works. I think that the work Tessa has done here is really wonderful and really expensive. And it's really exciting to think about, where people might go from here and how it might, how her work will be like a real starting point for other scholars as well, because it really is just a fantastic framework. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Julia, and thanks very much to Kasha and Stephen as well for 3 really wonderful and thoughtful responses. And thanks also to Tessa for giving us such a great and really personal overview of the book. It was really, really lovely. So our panel will now take your questions. Just a reminder to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just post your question and I'll relay it to our panel. I think we've got 1 question in already, 2. Okay, so the first question being asked is, the classical tradition, I'm not quite sure who it's for, but anyone can pitch in. The classical tradition works only as a source of fictional inspiration, or at the same time it gives the novelists the chance to criticize the political and social character of history as a whole, and how we can use literary texts in order to scrutinize as well as illuminate further the complexity and durability of human affairs. I don't know if anyone's got responses to that. It's more of a comment than a question, maybe.
Yeah, perhaps I could have a go, because I think this speaks to one of the big debates in classical reception studies between the idea that the classical tradition is a kind of sacred thing that simply continues through history, against the idea that what reception is really about is engagement and appropriation and dialogue with the classical tradition from an ideological and political perspective in many ways. And I think this is there in both forms in the works that Tessa discusses, and in classical reception generally. So we could be looking to sort of claim timeless importance for our work by echoing famous classical texts, or we can be using those texts to embody and debate the issues of our time. And I think that's precisely what most of these great writers are doing, especially, say, Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison. So I think the questions points very nicely to what are the big ideological debates within the reception community. What is reception about? Is it about honoring the golden tradition of the classics? Or is it about seeing how that tradition can be used in interesting ways to talk about our own concerns against the background of this common cultural heritage? So I think that I find that very relevant to the whole debate.
Brilliant. And the next one, I think the next one might also be for you, Stephen, but anyone who wants to field it. How necessary and or difficult is it to keep elusiveness or invocation, perhaps, apart from other enterprises such as adaptation, allegory, appropriation, or other modes in which the contemporary makes use of the ancient? Are there any methodological guidelines that one can recommend in keeping such operations manageable? That's a really good question.
Gosh, that is a very good question. I think what I would say is there's no such thing as a neutral allusion. Allusion is there's always something else going on, whether it's appropriation, inversion, commendation. So the idea that it can just be a footnote, as it were, in a world's classic, that this refers to a classical passage, I think has more or less disappeared because of the development of classical reception studies, because what classical reception studies says is, what's it about? Not just what bit of classics is being referred to here, but why, what is going on? Why this work, as I was saying earlier, why these genres? And so I think it's allusion, even just intertextuality is up there as a trope, and you have to work out the spin that's being put on the allusion as it's happening. That there's no such thing as an innocent allusion. Every allusion is ideologized, I would say.
Yeah, and maybe that also leads on to something that Julia was saying. Julia was saying that thinking about classical allusions gave you a way into thinking about the kind of gender politics of Roth's work. And then I was wondering if it was similarly helpful for you thinking about any of the other writers.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really love in Tessa's chapter on Robinson is the way she talks about the narrator's own experiences of studying the classics, and then how we see her deploying different classical allusions in her narration. And so it's Robinson using these allusions through the voice of, this young girl who's studying classics, I think specifically Latin. So I think it was really interesting for me as a student, like I said, coming to this from a non-classics background, sometimes worrying that I might be missing allusions, or wondering if there were, obvious things that, while they weren't, said by name, like that anyone who studied the classics would know was an allusion. Using Tessa's book as a way of, starting to understand how these writers are doing this then gave me a way to sort of know what to look for, but it's also all very interpretive. And so, there would be times where even if an allusion isn't named, you'd be like, oh, well, I think that this is calling back to, the myth of Philomela, or, whatever allusions I had on my mind at that time.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Another question. Talk about the influence of classical poets. Stephen Harrison mentioned that Apuleius is involved. I think it is interesting that they're all literary figures. Did you find, this maybe for Tessa or for Stephen or Julia, did you find that the classical historians such as Livy and Tacitus played any role in the development of modern writers?
I don't, I think, write about Livy or Tacitus, but I think that raises a really interesting point, which is you can't recognize an allusion unless you already know a lot about the source, because you're just not going to realize that it is an allusion. And I think that's why it's so important to talk to other people, because a book that was really important for me was Stephen Hines' book, Allusion and Intertext, I think it's called, which sort of marries classics to the sort of idea that people have been more comfortable with in English for ages about, abandoning the intentional fallacy, or, if you read a response series, if you think there's an allusion there and you can justify it, then that's good enough. But it's true that one is very shaped by one's readings are always shaped by what one already knows. So it doesn't necessarily mean, although I don't think I mentioned Tacitus, I think I maybe mentioned Livy once or twice, it doesn't mean that they're not just as important. It could also mean, which is true, that I know very little about Tacitus or Livy, so I'm unlikely to notice them. The other person I want to give a big shout out is my best friend Ovid, because this could have been a book about American fiction and Ovid, and I didn't want it to be, because I wanted it to be kind of more useful for teaching, but it would be brilliant if someone would write a book about American fiction and Ovid, because I think he always gets forgotten about, but he did seem to be in every book. That's probably my monomania by the end, but Ovid was kind of everywhere in my reading, so I just squeeze him in the closing minutes there.
I wanted to ask a question, maybe of Stephen, whether you kind of talked us through how one of the ways we can think of a particularly or specifically American version of classical reception is through thinking about the use of epic and tragedy. And then I was just wondering how that would compare to other fields of classical reception. Like, is that what makes it a particularly American engagement with classical tradition, do you think, that particular combination of tragedy and epic?
That's very interesting. I think, I mean, the people we're talking about in this book have essentially pretty much the same classical education as people say in UK or France in this period. And so to some extent, what they choose reflects what they read. But I do think that the Civil War is very interesting here, and how it naturally evokes the Iliad, where you have this long and difficult war with lots of stalemate, where one of the really interesting effects in the Iliad is the way in which many of the most attractive figures are on the losing side, and that does appeal to the Southern presentation of the losers of the Civil War. I think you can find these same genres exploited in very similar ways in contemporary, in English novels of the same period. I think the work of E.M. Forster, which I'm sure Tessa knows very well, is using pretty much the same set of texts, maybe Virgil a bit more than Homer. But I think what impresses me, and what I think Tessa has really emphasized, is how the texts that do come up really fit the big political and justice issues of America, and I think that's what's so effective. Especially, I would say, the Odyssey in the account of the Black journey from the South to freedom in the North. I think that's the idea of the journey ending in justice somehow. When Odysseus goes home, he goes home and restores justice in his kingdom, perhaps controversially, by killing his enemies. But I think that is reflected in the way in which people leave the South and go to a better life in the North. It's a journey towards justice somehow. So I think the answer to your question, Mike, is really probably the texts that come up in novels of the same period in say, England and France are not very different. But what's so interesting to me is how the themes are adapted very nicely to the major sort of cultural elements of the time. I think that's always, for me, what classical reception is about, how things are appropriated from one time to another, and can reveal so much about that time, and also about the classical works, reinterpreting them through very subtle reuse.
Yeah, brilliant. And there's a question that kind of leads on from that, I think, and it's for Kasha, but maybe Tessa might be best placed to answer it. Is there a particular reason that the classical tradition seems to appeal particularly to Black American novelists, not just Ellison and Morrison, as we've been discussing, but also Percival Everett, who sort of crops up briefly, and as the question says, who has returned again and again to the classical canon, and who's rewriting the Medea tragedy in For Her Dark Skin is an unjustly neglected gem. So nice shout out for that as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I suppose one key point is that African Americans were not allowed to read and write full stop as slaves. And so education and literacy became incredibly important. And beyond that, the classics were kind of officially deemed by Southern senators, for example, as beyond the reach, supposedly, of an African-American intellect, horribly enough. So in a way, there's a great deal to prove by mastering the classics and referring to it. It's almost part of, if you think of the classics as part of the humanities and humanism, it's sort of a way to assert your humanity and your American citizenship, and demand your equal right and access to that body of tradition that in the US has always been so key to American identity and Americanness and all the dominant American affinities that the dominant culture loves to draw with the classical past. But at the same time, we're very kind of exclusionary in doing that. So there's an awful lot at stake. And people like Paul Beatty, who I quote from, kind of play with that, sort of are quite ironic about the African-American access to classical tradition. So that's probably the most important reason, you know, everybody should have access to this tradition.
There's maybe we've got time for maybe one more question, and it sort of goes back to our earlier discussion a little bit. Has thought been given towards how allusive / intertextual the alluded to already is? You know, the word X author alludes to X myth. Do those myths in turn borrow too from previous material? I was thinking this kind of in relation to the question of how we distinguish between what's a classical allusion and what's just an allusion to something taught on the Great Books programme. So, you know, Roth's interest often seems to be as much about 1950s education as it is in the classics, or kind of where the two meet. So I don't know if anyone's got thoughts on that.
I probably think that kind of allusion is a kind of infinite process, and there's no kind of text where somebody didn't allude to somebody else. So I can't remember the other thing I was going to say, but oh yeah, so I tend to overuse the image of the palimpsest, which I really like, but so does everyone else, of the idea of kind of text written on text and written on text, and you can see all the different echoes and resonances sort of going back in time, or not necessarily in a chronological order, which is a kind of very loose and fluffy interpretation, but one that I like.
And finally, Julia, I wanted to ask you, everyone's talking about, you know, there could be more work to come from this. I'm just wondering how your experience with Tessa might influence your work going forward.
Yeah, I really loved working with Tessa because I think that, you know, approaching new texts can always feel a little bit daunting, and she always helped me to feel really welcome in approaching new texts. And so I think it was really exciting to, you know, watch her process of writing this book. And it definitely makes me think that I would love to, you know, do something like this, whether it's a study of different authors or diving into one author. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that would be. I mean, I really loved getting started that with my thesis, but I'm not sure what my larger field would be if I would go forward with it. Yeah, but she's definitely an inspiration.
Well, it sounds like an amazing training, and it sounds like you came through it with flying colours. So well done. I think we're out of time, but so thanks to all our panelists. Thank you, Tessa, and thanks everybody for coming. And please buy the book. And thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks.